you like me to push the button?
No, he's good. It's already working. These two are empty. Oh, I think it was two are. So that's why I know. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Oh, these two are chatting. We'll call you to order. Good evening, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Naomi Adland, and I am so delighted to welcome you to our last Salon at 475 for the 2018-19 program year. Exciting for us, although maybe less exciting for you. And I'm so happy to welcome our colleagues Chris Hayes and Shaul Magid to speak this evening about Shaul's new book, the Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament. You have their bios on the sheets on your chairs, so I'm not going to read them to you, but rest assured that they are both quite accomplished, have much to share, and we are very excited to be here and learning with them this evening. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Shaul, who will kick us off. Good evening.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out and coming uptown, or I guess some of you are coming downtown. Different places to hear about this book. I just wanted to start before I give up to Chris and we start a conversation about the book. And, many of us who write these kinds of books, there's always a backstory. Sometimes the backstory is pretty banal. Like your doctoral advisor tells you this is the topic that you have to do, or some other thing. But this book has an interesting backstory because it's something that really, for me, fell out of the sky, almost literally fell out of the sky. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the backstory of how I came to Zvi Soloveitchik, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So it starts in a very kind of a warm spring morning sometime. I think it was probably around. And the phone rang. I don't know when it was. Maybe it was 2010, 2011. And I got an email from a friend of mine. Some of you may know, named Menachem Butler. And the email had one line in it. It wasn't like, hello, how are you? The email was, have you ever heard of Zvi Soloveitchik? To which I answered no. And so he sends me back an email 5 minutes later with a PDF and 2 words that said, read this. And the PDF, I have actually a show and tell here. But the PDF was a PDF of a book, I can pass this around, by a podiatrist in New York City named Dov Hyman, who, the story goes, was in Jerusalem at the Great Synagogue, davening mincha, and he was, I don't know, he was looking around in the shelves in the back of the synagogue, and he discovered this book. And the book was a book by Zvi Soloveitchik, which is a Hebrew commentary to the book of Matthew. The book was published in a Protestant seminary in Jerusalem in 1985. So he starts to look through the book, and he starts to get interested in this character, and he spends the next 7 or 8 years traveling around Israel and Europe trying to find out as much about this person, Zvi Soloveitchik, as he can. And he produced this pamphlet, and this is just a copy of it, called Zvi Soloveitchik Ish Ktavav, the man and his work. And in this pamphlet, he goes through as much as he can, trying to piece together this person's life, and photocopies of the frontispieces of various books that he had wrote. This is the PDF that Butler had sent me. So I went through the PDF, sounded interesting. I decided to write an essay called The Soloveitchik That Loved Jesus, Who Loved Jesus, from Tablet magazine, about 6 months later. That came out. And I figured that was really going to be the end of it. Then about a month later, I get an email from a woman I didn't know named Jordan Levy, who was a translator for a press called Vine of David Press, which is a Christian press that translates various things. They actually translated Friedrich Delitzsch's Hebrew commentary to the New Testament, which was actually a wonderful work. In any event, she says, I read your article in Tablet, and I independently had found this person, Soloveitchik, and simply, for leisure, I started translating his Hebrew commentary to Matthew and David. Can I send you what I have? So he sent me what I had, and we kind of started talking. And the other thing that he had was he wrote a commentary to Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Luke had been lost. Mark is only extant in French translation, and Matthew is in the original Hebrew. So we had the French translation of Mark and the Hebrew translation of Matthew. And over the course of looking through the material, I started to realize this is a very bizarre person, and it's a very bizarre commentary. And as far as we know, it's the first commentary, the first verse-by-verse commentary in Hebrew to the New Testament that's written by a Jew who had not converted to Christianity. Because there were many Jews who became Christians who then wrote Hebrew. So I said to her, why don't we actually do this book together? She would translate the French, we would both work on the Hebrew, I would do annotations in a commentary, and then begin to write an introduction to this book. So I decided, okay, if I do that, then I really have to I really want my own copy of the 1985 Jerusalem edition. So I'm poking around the internet, asking around, I don't remember exactly how I did it. I get an email from a Protestant minister who ran a seminary in Arizona. And he said, I have 2 copies of the Hebrew translation to that. And I said to him, okay, whatever you want, just tell me how much you want, I'll buy it from you. He said, not only am I going to not take any money from you, but I'm going to pay the postage. And he sent me a copy of the book, and so I had that copy. So then we started working on it. But we realized that the 1985 edition is actually a reprint of an 1869 edition in Paris. That we couldn't find. The only edition that I knew about was because in a comment by an Israeli convert to Christianity from Givatayim, whose name I've forgotten, but I'll probably remember, he had said that he went to the Alliance Israelite in Paris, he found the original printing, he copied it, brought it back to Israel, and that's the version they used for the 1985 reprint. But we wanted to find the original print. The Alliance, we contacted the Alliance, they couldn't find it. It turns out that the National Library in Jerusalem had a reprint of the original 1869 Paris edition. So we went to the National Library, we made a copy of that, we compared the editions, they were basically the same, so we knew we were on solid footing. And then we spent the next 4 years going back and forth. We would go back and forth to translations, I was doing the annotations, and I just wanted to kind of end with this. For those of you who have, I know Michael Karasik here has done a tremendous amount of work in this kind of area. For those of you who have worked with a text that you're writing annotations to and a commentary, it's a really interesting enterprise, because when you do that with a text, it's like I felt like I was sitting in the Beit Midrash with Soloveitchik, and we were studying Matthew and Mark together. And I was looking up his sources, and I was finding other sources, and I was trying to unpack what he was doing and relate to some of the things that he was doing in literature. So it was this kind of, it's a level of intimacy that I think you can have with a text that you can only have when you're annotating and commenting on, as different from, let's say, reading and analyzing and examining and writing about it. So it became a kind of very personal thing for me to do, and we'll talk more about what he was doing and what he was trying to accomplish and so on. But I just wanted to kind of give you the backstory of how this thing really simply fell out of the sky. I had not heard of him. I then emailed Chaim Soloveitchik, who was Rav Soloveitchik's son, to see if Rav Soloveitchik had mentioned it to Chaim, and Chaim wrote me back and said he remembers that his father had said that he had some kind of a crazy cousin who lived in London, who was blind at the end of his life, because he did live in London at the end of his life, but that was it. And then it turned out that we found out that the great-great-great-grandson of Elijah Zvi Soloveitchik was Peter Salovey, who's the president of Yale. And he wrote, and he, when I contacted him, he knew a lot about him. His father had told him a lot of stories about his great-great-great-grandfather, who then Elijah Zvi Soloveitchik's son moved to Israel, and they lived there for a few generations, and then Peter Salovey's father moved from Palestine back to America. Anyway, there's a kind of story about that. So, he's a person who was also, the Soloveitchik dynasty, he was very early, he was the grandson of the Nefesh, of Chaim of Elijah. Chaim of Volozhin's daughter was Elijah Zvi Soloveitchik's mother. So he comes very early on in the Soloveitchik dynasty, and when I was doing research for the introduction and I was looking at all of, there's many books written about the Brisk tradition and the Soloveitchik dynasty, and he's really written out of all of them. In this long book by Karlinsky, a 600-page book called Shalshelet Brisk, the lineage of Brisk, there's one paragraph about it. Whereas his brother, Isaac Zvi, who was the father of, who became the Beis Halevi, who was the father of the Brisker Rav, for those that you know that dynasty, there are pages and pages and pages written about him. So they clearly knew what he was up to and didn't approve of it. But nonetheless, there we are, we brought it back to life. So thank you all for coming. That's the answer.
And that just gives you a taste of how interesting this is, you know. So when you sit down to read this, you're wondering all the time who this character is. And he is very enigmatic, and Shaul has done some spade work, you know, trying to put together, since we lack so much information of a true biographical nature. What Shaul does in his wonderful introduction is to paint a scene for us where, you know, he's trying to get the coordinates on this guy, right? So he's sort of triangulating from different positions to see if somehow we can map who he is by looking at his different contexts. So I thought that I would ask you to share with us some of these different paths that you went down in trying to locate him. So you offer a number of different contexts. And I guess what I'm going to be asking as we explore some of these is what these might tell us, these various explorations you have, what they might tell us about his motives. And sometimes he's explicit about his motives. Sometimes they're maybe a little more implicit because of the spirit of the times, right? But I know that in writing we always want to be responsible historians, but this is the oral Torah now, so maybe you'll feel freer to speculate a little bit, or as you sat next to him in the Beit Midrash, maybe you picked up some of his spirit and have a sense of how his mind ticks and what he was doing. But one of the first things that you do is you place him in, you know, Volozhin, and which is of course very close to Vilna. And Vilna was an interesting and teeming center. It was not simply the bastion of traditionalism. Other things were going on. So he was at the crossroads of some Jewish intellectual ferment, right? There was Maskilic thinkers and secular Jewish literature, right? Part of what's going on.
Sure.
But then you also place him in, how would you situate him for us, with other, both Jewish and non-Jewish figures who devoted themselves to figuring out the relationship between either Jesus and Judaism, or New Testament and Judaism, or Christianity and Judaism. There's a long tradition of people, whether it's people like Billerbeck Strock or Moore, or whether it's missionaries, or how would you situate him? Why is he unique, and how is he like?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about him is that he spent most of his life as an itinerant. He was apparently had health problems most of his adult life, and he spent a lot of his life going from city to city seeking medical help. And publishing a lot of things early on that were for the purposes of raising money to pay his medical bills. I mean, and he talks about that a little bit. But one of the fascinating things about it, from what Chris says, is that he's writing this probably throughout the beginning maybe the 1840s, 1850s, up to the 1870s. He's doing this commentary. It was really a life work. And at the same time, you had people like Abraham Geiger in Germany who were doing that. You had the emergence of the Tübingen School and the History of Jesus School. I mean, there was a foment of interest in Judaism and Christianity, in the Jewish Jesus, and so on. Never mentions any of them. He never mentions any of them. His commentary is a Tosafist commentary on the New Testament. I mean, he comes from Volozhin. I mean, that's basically where it's Maimonides, it's Chazal, it's Midrashim. He never mentions a modern source. He mentions a couple of Christian commentaries and a couple of Christians. One person in particular named Xavier Barnicki, who was a Polish nobleman who found his commentary very interesting and actually funded the publication of the Paris edition. And then Barnicki had a nephew who was a monk in the Vatican, so he got the original version sent to the Vatican. That's in the Vatican Library. So he talks about that, but he sees himself. I don't know whether he sees himself, but he he is completely, seemingly outside the orbit of a whole area of research done by Jews and Christians. Now again, he was a Jew that was born in Skletz and trained in Volozhin, and for him, Reform rabbis weren't, the Reform rabbis weren't to be taken seriously. I mean, he was basically a Volozhin Lithuanian, he was a Litvak in that sense. So he didn't have, what I find interesting is there's nothing maskilic about him. There's nothing kind of enlightenment-oriented about him, right? He's basically showing you verse by verse how if you understand the Talmud correctly, if you understand Maimonides correctly, you can understand that the New Testament is saying nothing in contradiction to Judaism whatsoever. Now, he doesn't write on Paul, and that may be a big piece of it. He's only writing on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in a certain sense, his interest is really in what scholars call the Jesus movement. He's interested in Jesus and the people around him and what Jesus was saying and what Jesus was teaching, rather than making a larger claim about Christianity. Because I think he feels like Christianity, in a certain way, went off track because it didn't really understand the Jewish context of the movement. Now, historically, it's a bit problematic, right? Because he's been bringing Babylonian Talmudic sources from the 6th century to prove a text that was written in the 2nd century, right? So he doesn't have a historical consciousness at all. For him, it's all just, in a certain sense, kind of certainly an unenlightened view of Talmudic literature. But I think that's partly what's unique about him is that he really is, as far as we know, working alone, isolated from the larger conversation about the Jewish Jesus, but making a very particular argument about the New Testament, and as something that Chris alluded to, he says explicitly, I think he was up to other things, but he says explicitly that if people would read his work, it would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. That the reason that Christians are anti-Semitic against Jews is because they don't understand their own Gospels. And the reason that Jews don't like Christians is because they don't understand the Gospel, because they don't read the Gospel. So he wanted to make the claim that he was going to be this link. Now, obviously, anti-Semitism is a lot more complicated than how you understand the New Testament. But that seemed to be, at least to my knowledge.
That approach, though, is that you single out is what makes him unique. I mean, you point out that others who take on some study of New Testament are either polemical against Christianity, or they are converts who are, championing its superiority or its supersessionism of Judaism. There might be some who are somewhere in between, but those tend to be the sorts of stances, and he's doing neither. And seems to be saying that there's just no difference, and yet he seems to blame both sides equally.
Yes.
So I just want to read what he writes in the foreword, which I think is so wonderful. He says, "I had no other goal but to reconcile these two enemy sisters, the church and the synagogue. I wanted to prove that this centuries-old enmity was based on dreadful misunderstandings through false interpretations by everyone, Jews and Christians, that were made concerning the words of Yeshua and the apostles, who tried to instill in humanity the love of one God and the love of one's neighbor." He said it, and he does throw equal shade on both, right? And he will go through several passages, and he'll say, this has been misunderstood by Christians this way. Christians have been misled. They misread it this way. And Jews who think, therefore, that that's what it really means, think it's terrible. But if they both understood that that's not what it means, then everything would be fine. They would see that they agree.
Right.
So again, he does this over and over and over again in the passages that you've translated. So he's blaming both sides for the hatred, which means for him, he thinks of anti-Semitism as theological. This is theological. And again, that's part of the bubble he's in, right? That, as you said, it's almost as if he's keeping all these other conversations out. It's the New Testament, it's the Talmud, and there's hatred. Why? Let me just go back to the texts and let's figure out how there shouldn't be hatred.
Right.
It's really quite theological. And baseless hatred. So that's one really interesting thing. And I wanted to ask you to describe Elijah Zvi's Jesus for us. Who is his Jesus?
Right. So his Jesus, he in one of the subtitles to one of the sections of the chapter is Soloveitchik's Maimonidean Jesus, because he basically gives us a Maimonidean Jesus, right? Jesus is a person who enters into the Jewish world whose primary goal was to preach the unity of God. That's basically what he was. And so, in a sense, and that is for Soloveitchik his messianic vocation. Now, whether Jesus was the Messiah or not the Messiah, Soloveitchik doesn't really weigh in completely. He says that what Jesus did was created the conditions for the Messiah, and that he was preaching the unity of the Creator. Now, in a certain way, that's not so distinctive, because you can find that in Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption too. I mean, later on, people are also making a similar claim that Christianity is actually the kind of extroversion and universalization of the main Jewish message. I mean, Rosenzweig is talking about Christianity writ large. Soloveitchik is only talking about Jesus. So basically, Jesus is this Maimonidean figure because Maimonides stands at the center of the Volozhin imaginary, so to speak. That and everything can be filtered through the Rambam. Everything is filtered through Maimonides. That what every statement that Soloveitchik that Jesus makes, that seems to be the kind of classic statement of his being the Messiah, or of his preaching something that might be problematic vis-a-vis the rabbis. It all gets refracted for Soloveitchik through Maimonides. It's all about the unity of God. And that basically is, that's all he was teaching. He wasn't teaching against the law. He was teaching that this is the message that needs to get out in order to create the possibility for redemption.
Yeah, the comment that you made about Ramban brings to mind another great quote, where he's, again, talking about his purpose. But he says that I wanted to show that the New Testament goes hand in hand with the Talmud. I wanted to bring every give and take of the Talmud that corresponded with the subjects we've been discussing. But if I had done that, this would have become a much larger book, so I will cite the words of the Rambam.
Right.
So he does this. There'll be a passage where there'll be some miracle, and he'll say, "Oh, Rabbi so and so in Bavli Zachim did the same thing."
Right.
And he'll cite some passage in the Talmud where someone touches someone and they're healed, or does some similar thing. This is common stuff. So he does that, but sometimes it's too much to go to the text, and so he just sort of goes to Rambam and Rambam's explanation of it, particularly when it comes to immortality. How does he? You want to explain what he does with sort of the resurrection and immortality, and how he really Maimonidizes that?
Right. So Maimonides makes a very kind of complicated, somewhat sleight of hand on the question of resurrection in his letter on resurrection that he wrote, as well as in places in the Guide of the Perplexed, and a lot of later authorities basically question whether Maimonides did believe in bodily resurrection or not. Or whether he basically collapses resurrection into the immortality of the soul, which is an old kind of Greek idea. And what Soloveitchik does is he uses that Maimonidean move of explaining bodily resurrection through the prism of the immortality of the soul. And he's basically saying that's doing what Jesus is doing as well. That now, again, these are admittedly forced interpretations. However, I want to bring up something that I said to Chris before, that a couple of years ago, I gave a paper on Soloveitchik's commentary to Matthew at the Society for Biblical Literature, a group of Matthew scholars, right, who had obviously never heard of him, right? And I put his picture up there on the and one of the things that was so striking to these Matthew scholars, I mean, these are people who spend their entire lives, right, not only working on Matthew, but working on like 3 verses in Matthew. One of the things that was so surprising to them is they said, this is a person that's writing a commentary to Matthew outside of the entire canonical tradition of Christian interpretation. It's as if he's a 4th century Jewish Christian, right? And I use the pseudo-Clementine homilies, right, which is a 4th century text of kind of Jewish Christian. In other words, what's so surprising, like they were saying, like nobody does this. Nobody writes a commentary on Matthew as if the entire Christian interpretive tradition doesn't exist. So that was, what, in a sense, what was so striking. It was almost for them somebody going back to early Christianity without knowing, he wasn't doing that knowingly. He just wasn't interested in any of those interpretive traditions in order to do that. So I think that he makes these kind of what Christians might call forced interpretations. What rabbis might say, because of course all of those passages in the Talmud that he cites, we all know those passages. I mean, there's nothing, he's not creating anything new. He's just basically trying to create a lens, which is what an interpretation does, right? It's really actually like creating a lens through which to see these Christian texts.
Right, it's so fascinating because as many commentators will do, they start to develop a certain vocabulary. Whenever they see a certain term, it will always be commented on or interpreted in the same way. And I started to collect a little set of those, you know, and so Messiah was one of them, which, as you said, you know, he really describes the Messiah simply as someone who's righteous, a tzaddik. He uses the word tzaddik for Messiah, and there have been many, and Jesus had many of the qualities that would make him worthy of being called a Messiah, and then he gives Talmudic texts which show various figures being called, you know, Mashiach and Hezekiah, you know, various people in biblical history and so on. So nothing unusual about this. Good news, the phrase good news simply is the teaching that God is one. It's just monotheism, Mosaic monotheism, that's all it is. So every time that phrase comes up, he glosses it the same way. The Son of God simply means a person who's Maimonidean Son of God, right? Whose rational capacity, he follows his rational instead of his fleshly or bodily urges, because reason is a part of us that comes from God, so he's a rational. So a Son of God simply means somebody who's righteous through following their rational desires instead of the body. Son of Man, that's an interesting one. He takes that to just mean a human being, a Ben Adam, a mortal, and doesn't give it any messianic readings, which we know began to develop in the 1st century BCE or around that time. And resurrection, when Jesus keeps saying, I'll come back in 3 days, all he's doing is trying to prove to people the whole principle of immortality. And I thought it was really interesting that Soloveitchik says, because at that time there was doubt about it. And if you look in the Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1, it says, right, that people who doubt that there's a world to come or resurrection's not taught in the Torah, you know, terrible things happen precisely because the rabbis knew it's not actually taught in the Torah. And so there was doubt about it, about resurrection. So it seemed to me he was sort of taking that fact from rabbinic tradition of Mishnah, that this was something that people had to sort of be dogmatic about because no one could teach it from the Torah. And so Jesus chose this way, to die and then come back and say, woo, I'm still alive, just to prove to you all, there's immortality. That's all it was about. He wasn't divine, it was just an object lesson in immortality.
I mean, one of the things that brings up, which is so interesting, is that traditionally Jews are so accustomed through the centrality and importance of Maimonides as a figure. They're so accustomed to be able to accept metaphorical readings of Torah verses. Whereas they're less accustomed to acknowledging that when it's New Testament verses. And in a certain sense, what Soloveitchik is doing, he's reading the New Testament the way Maimonides, and not only Maimonides, but the interpretive tradition that comes from Maimonides reads the Torah. So to say that, well, that's a kind of a far-flung, that's a far-flung reading of Son of Man, it's a far-flung reading of resurrection or Jesus rising in 3 days. He'll show you places in Maimonides where Maimonides does that about, the famous passage about Abraham and Sarah, her giving birth when she was 90 years old. I mean, all of these kind, or Abraham's dream of seeing the angels, right? Maimonides is precisely introducing this kind of metaphorical understanding that's coming from Greek philosophy, and there was a big controversy about Maimonides in its time, but ultimately he's still a canonical reader.
That raised the question of audience, and I found that and you dealt with this really well in the introduction. He's sort of writing to everybody, and I found that as I was reading it, I couldn't figure out if sometimes he seemed to be addressing a Christian reader, sometimes a Jewish reader. The examples that you've just given, he gives many lessons in. This is the way Jews spoke and read Scripture, so don't be surprised. Let me show you. And there's one passage on page 83, where this is where he talks about the fact that in the New Testament, there are many times when they will say, and this was to fulfill the word that was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, or this is to fulfill the word that was spoken by the prophet Micah or Jeremiah. And they'll cite some verse, and of course it only fulfills it if you sort of stand on your head and squint and look sideways, right? It's always a sort of a forced interpretation, it's something strange. So he cites one of those, where Jesus settles in Nazareth, fulfilling the word spoken by the prophets that he will be called a Notzri, one from Nazareth, right? And then he says, a prominent Christian sage asked me, Elijah, how Matthew could take that verse from Jeremiah out of its plain context, and use it to say that it somehow was pointing to Jesus, many centuries later. And Elijah just was like, we do this all the time.
I'm coming from Volozhin.
He says, let me explain to you the interpretation methods of the Talmud. So you can see the New Testament writers were Talmudists. I wish I had a nickel for every time he said.
Yes.
The New Testament writers were Talmudists.
Right.
And he explains there's a written Torah, there's an oral Torah, there's interpretations, there's stuff in there. We don't really know where it comes from. Sometimes they cite a verse, it's just a mnemonic or something to help you remember. And everybody knows it's not the plain meaning. And if you understood this, you Christians, you wouldn't get so hung up about your own scriptures.
Right.
So sometimes he's chastising Christians who,
Yes.
who they need the Talmud to understand how Jews thought and talked and played
Right.
with their own scripture. He even says it's artificial exegesis, and he uses the word play. And I'm not bothered by this at all. These manipulations, that's what we do. We never think that that's the real meaning of the verse. It's just fun we have with the verse.
Right.
But on the other hand, is he also saying, however, that Jews need Christians? I mean, I got the feeling more that he was saying Christians, to understand Scripture, you need Talmud and Judaism. Is he ever saying that Jews need the New Testament?
I think only to the extent that Jews need to read the New Testament with my interpretation in order to disabuse themselves of this kind of nonsense of Jesus, of Christianity being idolatry. In other words, there's an anti-Semitism component here, and then there's an anti-Christian component. And he's basically saying the Jews are as anti-Christian as the Christians are anti-Semitic. Of course, the anti-Semitism is worse because the Christians have the power, and Jews don't have the power. But Jews' negative attitude towards Christians, Soloveitchik is saying this, is no better than the Christian negative attitude towards Jews. And it's because they don't really see that Jesus is a Maimonidean hero of the first century, And in a certain way, that comes back later with the Zionist reclamation of Jesus, with the Brenner affair, the famous controversy between Yosef Chaim Brenner and Achad Ha'am about whether Jesus should be included in the new Zionist canon of Jewish heroes. Right? There was a whole debate that went on between Brenner and Achad Ha'am that was covered in all of the press in the early 20th century about whether, when they were kind of creating this new Zionist canon, whether Jesus should be considered a Jewish figure. Brenner said yes, and Achad Ha'am said no. And it happened largely around a controversy regarding Russian converts to Christianity, Russian Jewish converts to Christianity, which is a kind of a bridge to the question of conversion, which is something he never speaks about, but I think is really central in the project. He was living at a time when there was an effort in the Russian Empire to convert the Jews to Christianity, starting with Alexander I, and not for reasons of anti-Semitism. Alexander I wanted to convert the Jews to Christianity because he was a kind of spiritualist, and he felt that this would bring the Jews into the kind of modern, the modern spiritual world that he saw. So what he does is he brings in an Irish minister named Alexander McCall, who was living in London, who had an institute for the conversion of Jews to Christianity, to Russia, to actually try to convert Jews to Christianity. What comes out of that is Nehemiah Solomon, who was a Jewish convert to Christianity, published the first Yiddish translation of the New Testament in 1821 that was used for proselytizing purposes. You had other very, very interesting figures. This guy Stanislav Hoga, who I talk about, who David Ruderman has written about. a number of different Jewish converts to Christianity who became part of this institute, and they translated a lot of McCall's work into Hebrew. There was a book by McCall called Old Paths in the Talmud, which is basically a book that tries to show the errors of the Talmud. Now, McCall lived for years in Palestine and in Warsaw. He knew Aramaic, he knew Hebrew, he knew Yiddish, and he was actually quite a philo-Semite. He organized in 1840 around the Damascus blood libel. Some of you know, in 1840 there was a big Damascus blood libel. He organized a group of 50 Jewish converts to Christianity to sign a letter that it is false that Jews use Christian blood for Passover. Right? So he was actually quite a philo-Semite in a way. Now all of this is happening, and in a sense, I think that Soloveitchik he certainly knew about this. First of all, he was living in London where McCall was living. Second of all, he's from Russia, and he was traveling around Russia at that time. I think part of what he's trying to do is make a case of the symmetry between Judaism and Christianity, to say to Jews, you don't have to convert, because it's the same thing. It's an interesting argument against conversion.
And yet it's not, and you talk about this Stanislaus Hoga. It doesn't sound exactly like him though, because he sounds to me more like a Jews for Jesus. That you can be a Jew and still believe in the divinity of Jesus, but I don't hear Soloveitchik saying that. Jesus is not divine. No, he's been misunderstood.
Right.
And that's why it's not necessary. There's nothing to convert to. It's as if he's brought Jesus back home.
Right. And Hoga was a Christian. And then there's he converted to Christianity. He converted to Christianity. He was a Jew from Poland. He was known afterwards as Chatzkala HaMeshumad. And he disappears, leaves his wife and kids, ends up somewhere else in Russia, comes out as a Christian, changes his name to Stanislaus Hoga, has another family, hooks up with McCall, translates McCall's book, Old Paths to the Talmud. The Hebrew title was Netivot Shalom. So it was kind of hidden as a kind of, missionary text. And Ruderman is kind of, there's a lot of people that have written about that. Ruderman takes a different stance than most. Most people claim that he actually reverted back to Judaism at the end of his life, Hoga. Ruderman claims that he doesn't think that that's true. He thinks that he kind of remains a Christian, but he does re-own his Judaism in a way. So he kind of comes back.
And we don't have as much insight into Elijah, unfortunately.
No.
And so there was one passage that caught my attention. So, because we've talked about whether this was a response to conversion and sort of saying to Christians, to Jews, you don't need to convert. If anything, I've shown you that you would be, Jesus is part of Judaism, right? And everything that he was teaching was Mosaic monotheism and the immortality of the soul. You've got that already. You don't need anything else. But yet there's this one passage that seems rather impassioned on behalf of Jesus, which made me wonder if there was, is he the rabbi who fell in love with Jesus, or is this just about not converting? And the passage is this one. He's gone through in several places to show that Jesus didn't do many of the things that Christians understand to have done. He didn't say you don't have to observe the dietary laws. He was objecting to ritual washing of hands, and there were rabbis in the Talmud who object to that. He didn't violate the Sabbath about plucking the grain. His disciples were hungry, and even in the Talmud, you are allowed to violate the Sabbath if people are hungry and so on. So he says in that passage, the Talmud itself formally permits violating the holiness of the Sabbath when in the presence of a superior holiness, interest in human life. Yeshua said nothing more than that, and whosoever, Jew or Christian, claims that he disregarded the Sabbath in cases where human life was of no interest, he spews out genuine slander against Yeshua. And it seems a little more impassioned than just, look at this, there's a match. That, they agree. And so, and that's, again, one of those little straws you clasp at to try to get inside.
Yeah. I mean, from the work I did, he did really actually have, maybe this was the occupational hazard. He fell in love with the subject in a certain way, and I think he became impassioned about. He started out trying to claim that there was no distinction, but he became passionately engaged with this figure, this heroic figure that he's. But never once, ever, does he ever even consider becoming a Christian.
No.
There's nothing. It was never. everything he spoke was actually against that.
And again, as you've pointed out, why would he? Jesus is a Talmudic sage.
Right.
I mean, he actually maps Jesus onto the sects at the time. You know, he says that Jesus and his followers were Essenes, and so that's why they disagreed sometimes with the Pharisees, because but those were minor disputes over hand washing
Right.
or fasting, and even there he took more of but on the big things, the fundamentals, the unity of God, immortality, resurrection, they were one against the Sadducees. So in his story, the Sadducees are the bad guys.
Right.
Right? It's the Pharisees and Jesus. So what's there to convert to? It's just a brother sect, but we all are under the same basic tent of Judaism. So how is he different from other famous harmonizers that we've seen? I mean, if you think of Philo, who dedicates himself to showing that the Mosaic law is compatible with Greek thought, and especially Stoicism, and he writes his commentaries in Greek to those who are perplexed maybe by the apparent disjunction between the two, and to show, though, there's a fundamental identity.
Right.
Rambam himself shows, right, the compatibility of Judaism with Aristotelianism and other philosophical trends, and he writes in Arabic, the language of philosophy, to those who are perplexed by the seeming distinctions. So is Elijah Zvi simply another harmonizer showing the compatibility of Judaism with New Testament, or with Jesus at least, and writes, interesting, what language does he write in? He writes in Hebrew, but it's immediately, and first actually translated and published in French. So again, audience, who's he really? He's really writing to everybody,
So
right?
in terms of the person that I think, obviously Maimonides, but the other person that he really models himself after is Yaakov Emden. Because Yaakov Emden, who was a leading Central European rabbinic figure, was, and Soloveitchik mentions Emden in another place, was one of the first people in his world that wrote positively about Christianity, and wrote against attributing idolatry to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
He certainly doesn't go nearly as far as Soloveitchik does, but Emden becomes a kind of, in a certain way, a model for him. I talk about him in the connection between Emden and Christianity. Now, the one interesting caveat is that Emden doesn't speak positively about Christianity in its own right. Rather, he's using a positive view of Christianity in his polemic against Sabbatianism. Right? Now, I don't think that Soloveitchik probably knew that. But he basically, and this is actually taken from a long essay by J.J. Schachter on Yaakov Emden's view of Christianity, where he says that Schachter notes that Emden uses Christianity as a way to falsify and demonize Sabbatianism as a new religion, one that should be condemned by Jews and Christians alike. So he was trying to get Christians to become sympathetic to Jews in order to fight against Sabbatianism. Because in Emden's time, Sabbatianism was really the danger.
Well, that's sort of like his Sadducees. They
Yes.
didn't believe in immortality.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Everybody has to find their enemy.
Right.
And then we can be in alliance against that common enemy.
But in terms of the audience, which is a good question. So one thing, in 1850, he publishes a book called The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament. But it's not actually the book that we did. It was a commentary on Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith that he published in English in 1850 in London, which was the kind of prelude to this, because he's basically trying to argue that all of these principles of faith Christians believe in also. So it's a setup. So he's making a Maimonidean setup by offering an English translation, obviously for Christians, of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith that would in a sense work with the Christianity of the time. Then he finishes his commentary. He publishes it in French. He publishes it in German. He publishes it in Polish. And only after all of that, at the end of his life, he publishes the original Hebrew.
Right.
So it's clear that he wanted Christians to read it. He also wanted Jews to read it, but he clearly wanted Christians to read it. And he spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources getting these things published, going to Paris, going to Leipzig, going to Warsaw, making sure that this thing was getting out, making sure it gets in the Vatican Library. So he clearly has both audiences in mind, but one might say that actually he had the Christian audience in mind more than the Jewish
It
audience.
felt like that, and then every now and then there would just be something where when he was talking about the way Christians use Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant, and they interpret that as referring to Jesus, and he says, look, the Talmud, the Jewish tradition has done that. We've applied the suffering servant to Hezekiah, we've
Right.
applied it to Rabbi Akiva, we've applied, all right, then the gospel's no different. And there he seems to be talking to Jews. Like, is he sort of
Yes.
saying, why are you so upset that they take the suffering servant and say it's Jesus? All it's saying is that he suffered, that's it. You've done that and you've used it the same way. So it's funny, he really seems to be speaking to all groups. And
Yeah.
I just had two more questions, if I may. And one is about the title of the work, which is Kol Koreh, and then we'll open it up for questions here. But the title is Kol Koreh, A Voice Cries Out, which of course is from the famous passage in Isaiah 40, which is a more difficult passage than it appears, right? Because is it saying, a voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord? Or do the words in the wilderness, does that apply to Kol Koreh? A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare a path for the Lord. And this is, Christian interpreters took in the wilderness to apply to the Kol Koreh, right? That a voice cries out in the wilderness, and that means it's John the Baptist who's crying out in the desert, in the wilderness. But Jewish tradition has pretty much always understood it to be a voice cries out, prepare a path for the Lord in the wilderness, right? So he just has Kol Koreh,
Right.
a voice calls out. And I may be too fertile in imagination here, but you've sat next to him in his Beit Midrash, and studying with him. And I just wonder if it's a self-reference, if it's a cry of hope or warning or despair, whether he sees himself as the voice that's crying, and if so, does he feel like he's calling out and he is preparing a way in the wilderness, or does he feel like he's calling out in the wilderness? Is he the naive optimist that you describe him as in 33?
Right,
Is he the voice who feels, I have to say this even though I know no one will hear, or does he really believe someone will hear? Is he optimistic?
First, Kol Koreh was a very, very common title. There are literally hundreds of books.
Oh, well, that just blows that
question. No, it is actually a very common title. But I do think that he saw himself that way. There's something I was looking for, I can't find, where he basically is lamenting. He's saying, oh, and the Christians will say
Yes.
about me, do you know what page it's on?
keep going out.
Where the Christians will say about me, how dare you, Rabbi, write a commentary on our scriptures, and the Jews will say about me, oh, Elijah, what happened to you? What became of you? So there's that sense where he realizes he's kind of lamenting his own fate. That I think it's the second interpretation that you said, which is that he saw himself as crying out in the wilderness.
Yeah, and that is such a moving passage, actually. That's one of the most moving passages, because listen to what he says. I know that I will not escape from the criticism from both sides, Jews and Christians. My Hebrew brethren will say, what happened to Rabbi Eliyahu? Yesterday he was one of us, today he's filled with a new spirit. So they're going to see duplicity. And my Christian brother will say, this one who is a Jew comes to reveal to us the secrets of the gospel. How can we accept that he speaks correctly and a true spirit dwells within him? And this is so interesting. He says these two extremes are really saying the same thing. That is, it cannot be that he is speaking with his mouth what he believes in his heart. They're both accusing me of duplicity.
Right.
And he says, and on this criticism, my soul weeps uncontrollably. Only God knows, and God is my witness, that in this I am free of sin. I really am saying what I think.
Right.
And I know both sides will
Right.
think that I'm being duplicitous, that I can't believe what I'm saying, either because of my genealogy, or those who see me as having a certain genealogy cannot understand how with that genealogy I can be where I am now. I make no sense to anyone,
Right.
and no one can see me as genuine.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Yeah. And I guess the code to that is, he never really found an audience among Jews. I mean, not until now, anyway. I have to thank Dov Hyman, who's no longer alive, right? But if he hadn't found that pamphlet, that the Heichel Shlomo, when he should have been davening mincha, was looking at the books, right? He wouldn't have
He's
written.
buried there now.
He wouldn't have written what he wrote. It's interesting that this Protestant seminary in Jerusalem in 1985 did make a reprint of it. So, so it must have had some cachet with a Christian, with some afterlife with a Christian audience. I don't know if there were reprints in the German, French, and Polish translations. So there is this, you know, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes you'll see in the ancient world, less so in the modern world, where somebody dies in obscurity and then hundreds of years later they get discovered and all of a sudden they become these important figures when for centuries they were not known. And I think in the case, this is the case with Elijah Zvi. Now, obviously, he wasn't correct about anti-Semitism, and you know, and we can take issue with his with an ahistorical interpretation of his reading of Chazal or his reading of the New Testament. But here you have a figure who's living at a certain period of time, who really truly, as you read in that last passage, who really truly believed with all of his heart and all of his soul that he had found a missing link, that somehow he was going to be able to bring these two warring factions, theological factions, together. You know, two religions that were at war with each other, right? One religion considered the other one no longer relevant or no longer viable. The other religion called the other one idolatry, right? So that they were at loggerheads. But from Soloveitchik's view, and maybe that part of the lesson, they actually all come from the same fountain. They both come from the same fountain. And somehow he you know, just the attempt to do that, I think there's something to be learned from as a person. But even if you know, if you buy the book and you go through the commentary, I mean, it really is some fascinating stuff.
Yes.
The way in which he's able to read these rabbinic texts back into the New Testament in ways that nobody we had before. Now, it is true that Claude Montefiore in the early 20th century also wrote a Hebrew commentary. Now, whether he knew of Soloveitchik's commentary, he was also writing in London, whether he knew of Soloveitchik's commentary or not, I don't know. So it's not like people haven't done it since then. But
The goals were so different.
the goals were very, very different, yeah, you're right. It was a different time.
My last question is
Yeah.
a little bit about you and your intellectual framework. You've also written on Meir Kahane.
I have, yes.
Who's a very different figure, but in some ways.
Just understated.
But yeah, not all about coexistence or tolerance, but he, you know, he also is a non-mainstream figure. So I wonder if there's something that attracts you about non-mainstream figures. I get that this sort of fell into your.
So?
Well, I mean, I don't just mean that. I mean, but why? What's the utility for us? Why? What do you hope that we see and we learn when we study some of these figures? Whether it's someone like a Meir Kahane, or on the other extreme, somebody like an Elijah Zvi.
Or, I mean, I've written on Nachman of Bratslav and Mordechai Yosef of Ishbitz, were also, I mean, now much more mainstream figures, but in their time. I guess for me, there's a certain magnetism to the marginal, to that line where creativity and heresy kind of meet, and the energy that's produced in those moments, and the way in which some of those figures, and you can see them with someone like Nathan of Gaza too, and the Sabbateans, where some of those figures, it's precisely approaching that border that, you know, that's a certain kind of creative energy that happens where they get these individuals get freed from apologetics, they get freed from kind of the weight of authority, and I'll leave it to my analyst to figure out why I'm attracted to those people. But no, I mean, my entire intellectual career has been really actually working on the margins of things. And I didn't really, I mean, Elijah Zvi came to me. I didn't come to him.
I know.
Right? No, interestingly, I mean, maybe kind of there's some serendipity there. But, or he fell into my lap. Look, he could have fallen into somebody else's lap and they would have just put it aside.
Right, and you didn't pass it to a graduate student. I mean, you just.
Yes, I didn't do that, right, exactly.
So, but it's actually, you close out your introduction with, I think, a really wonderful line, which I think, well, to me, it seems to suggest that there's something about the naive optimist in Elijah Zvi that you admire. was you say that perhaps in this century, we can examine it, the Kol Koreh, anew, not necessarily as a template for the reconstruction of Judaism and Christianity, right? Not for its historical merits, telling us anything about ancient Judaism and Christianity, as much as a valiant attempt to bend the arc toward an era of coexistence and tolerance built on the dunghill of mutual hatred. And I just think that's a fabulous, that the utility in looking at this is really that he modeled and desired, he modeled and had a desire for the attempt for some kind of coexistence and tolerance. And, whether it was naive and whether it was a complete failure and whether antisemitism is about so much more, but there's something in that seemed either beautifully quixotic and, like Don Quixote with an impossible dream or something.
I have an essay that's coming out in January, a comparison of Zvi Soloveitchik and Oswald Rufusson, who probably some of you know as Brother Daniel, who was a Polish Jew who converted to Christianity, became a Carmelite monk, and then tried to immigrate to Israel under the law of return in 1958. He was denied entry, and then it became a Supreme Court case that was really the landmark case of who was a Jew. And I kind of put these two people in conversation with them, because he's a very, Rufusson, if you don't know the story, a very heroic figure, saved thousands of Jewish lives during the war. He was basically undercover, so to speak, as a Polish national, and ended up working for the Nazi police and saving the Mir ghetto and all of these kinds of things. And they're an interesting contrast, because on the one hand, Rufusson becomes a Christian and claims that he can still be a Jew. And Soloveitchik remains a Jew and doesn't claim that he can be a Christian, but he claims that his love of Christianity, his admiration of Christianity, is really part of an expression of
It's
Jewishness.
identical with his Judaism. Well, thank you for a fabulous book.
Thank
Maybe
you.
there are questions.
Thank you very much, Shaul and Christine. I'm still complex who his audiences were, and I wonder if you consider that perhaps he was writing for those who left who were neither Jews and neither Christians, and he wanted them to come back. Because which was a trend at that time.
Yeah.
Even Shneir Zalman's son, Moshe, converted to Christianity.
Sure.
Moshe Maimonides, wasn't it around that time?
Yeah.
It was a trend. So perhaps,
Oh, yes, there were a lot of.
why is he writing in Hebrew, and then
Although it got published
if you
last.
want to reduce anti-Semitism, why are you writing it in Hebrew?
Well, he wanted it in Hebrew because he wanted.
That's
it-
all he knew.
He wanted Yeah, that's all he knew. That's not what's one thing. That's the only language he knew. But besides that, he wanted it to be he knew that he was writing the first commentary in Hebrew to the New Testament by a Jew. He knew that, and he wanted it to be a sefer, right? And I'll pass around the copy. I mean, I have a copy of the edition. I think
Yeah,
that.
that's coming.
He wanted Jews to read it, but Chris is right. Only at the end of his life he publishes the Hebrew. He publishes it in French.
possible that
French,
he was
German,
Polish.
Polish.
Reaching out to the middle?
Well, I
Those who
think.
left, did you consider that?
That was one of the questions. That's why I went down the rabbit hole of conversion and looked at the context of what was going on in Russia and Central Europe at that time in terms of the organized attempt to convert the Jews to Christianity, which, according to Todd Enderman, didn't really work that well. There weren't that many people who actually converted, but there were some important ones who became, August Neander, who became a great church historian, who was from the Moses Mendelssohn's family. So there were some great people, and also Moses Mendelssohn's children. So there were some great people who did convert. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Again, we don't know what his audience is because he doesn't tell us.
But as you point out, he literally never talks about conversion.
Never.
He does talk a lot about wanting to heal the enmity between the two groups. That comes up
Right.
multiple times, but he never
Right.
talks about people changing or converting or
But he's
come back.
legitimizing Jesus. He's legitimizing.
He's Judaizing Jesus.
He's Judaizing Jesus.
He's Judaizing
Yeah, right.
Jesus.
Sure.
You've misunderstood Jesus all these years. He never claimed to be divine. He absolutely followed not only Mosaic law, he followed rabbinic law. I love the way he proves that he observed the Sabbath, 2,000 cubit boundary, because when he's talking about the apocalypse and how everyone's going to flee when the apocalypse comes, he says, just hope that it doesn't happen on a Sabbath. And he goes, that proves that he believes in the rabbinic. He held by the Arabs because otherwise he wouldn't flee far enough, right? He was rabbinic, and he says the bracha, and he said Hallel at Pesach, which was the Last Supper, he said the Hallel.
But he didn't believe in Arab component.
Well. Yeah.
Thank you. I think as someone who has spent so much time in Baroque Park years ago, will be the first to acknowledge that this Kol will never be on a poll as,
Yes, no, I don't think so.
My question is, I understand that Dr. J.J. Schachter's, the excerpt that you gave us notwithstanding, the Yavits understood Christianity as the religion for non-Jews. I don't want to use the term Gentile because that means something else, but the religion for those who should keep the 7 Noahide commandments. And so, and the idea of having, Christians simply be allies in the fight against Sabbateanism isn't the main idea that this is the religion, and something that the Meiri, that they didn't have access to. We now know in the times that we show the Meiri considers Christianity to not be avodat galilim, to be not idol worship, because of similar ideas going back centuries before the Yavit. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that now the Meiri, of course, Menachem Meiri, a 14th century Talmudic commentator, wasn't really known about until pretty much until the Cairo Geniza. So Soloveitchik wouldn't really have known about him. He certainly did know about Emden. And Emden does make that move to basically say that Christianity is the religion should be the religion of, the legitimate religion of the Gentile. I think that, what Schachter does is basically say, well, yes, that's true, he thought that, but he was also using it, he was triangulating it with the Sabbateans. But I think Soloveitchik is going further, he's going quite a bit further. Because Emden does actually mention New Testament passages in his Hebrew writing. He does quote New Testament passages, which itself is pretty unique in its time. But he never sat down to actually go through verse by verse to address all of those claims. So it was really kind of more in a general sense. And again, Emden was speaking largely about Christianity versus Soloveitchik, who was speaking almost primarily about Jesus.
Two brief questions. First is, what text was he using?
Oh, so that's a good question. I have a whole section in the introduction on that. If you buy the book, you'll see. Basically, that was one of our biggest problems. We didn't know what New Testament text he was using. As far as we knew, he did not know Greek, so he was not using the Septuagint. He was not the Septuagint. He was not using the Greek reading, the original. It's not clear that he knew any other language other than Hebrew well enough to use his translation. So what we decided on to use the translation of, what's his first name? Franz Delitzsch, who Leopold Sunz, and I only saw this later in Isma Shorish's great biography of Leopold Sunz. Leopold Sunz called Delitzsch the greatest Hebraeus of the 19th century. Right? And Delitzsch was a Christian clergy of sorts who translated the New Testament into Rabbinic and Mishnaic Hebrew. There were other translations of the New Testament into Hebrew at the time, and there was Nehemiah Solomon's translation into Yiddish, but it's unlikely that he probably used that. Delitzsch's translation was available, the Hebrew translation was available during Soloveitchik's lifetime, and he maintains all of the, the Hebraic versions of the names, and he basically, he's writing before there's really a modern Hebrew. So we decided that Delitzsch's translation was, if he didn't use Delitzsch's translation, that was probably the closest that we got. So that's the translation that we used.
Right. And the second one is New Testament. Does he use Brit Hadashah? Is that the term that he's using?
When he refers to the New Testament?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And do you have a sense of what he meant by that?
I mean, I think that would be the only, trying to think if he uses the term gospel in some way. He uses the term b'chadashah. That would be the operative.
You know, there was a reference that puzzled me when he was talking once about Ben Sira, which of course is not in the Hebrew Tanakh,
Right.
but he says in our Bibles, he uses the first person plural.
Uh-huh.
It appears as ecclesiasticus. But it's interesting that he says in our Bibles there. My
Right.
antenna went up. There are a
Right.
few times he uses the we voice.
Yes, a few times he
That's
does.
Christian, but,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
just to complicate things even further,
How do you
what he's
understand
thinking different texts are, I
How do you understand the plural?
no idea,
Right.
no idea.
Why is it unlikely that he would have used the Yiddish?
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, he probably would have known that Nehemiah Solomon was a Meshumad, that he was a convert to Christianity. That might be one. It wasn't really that available. I mean, it was published in 1821, in Poland, so he could have used it. But I would think that he probably would have wanted something a little bit more authentic in his mind. I think, it seems to me, again, I don't really know, it seems to me that that's what he would have wanted. But this was a question that we couldn't find an answer to. We really, I mean, it's interesting that he never tells us what text he's using.
But he does believe it was originally written in Hebrew.
Yeah, so that's the
And
other thing.
Felix doesn't.
Right. He believed that, which was very common in that time, that the original version of the gospel was written in Hebrew. Delitzsch already
He just
said that it was not, and that's basically the common view today, that the New Testament, the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, were not originally written in Hebrew, they were originally written in Greek by Jews. But Soloveitchik believed that they were originally in Hebrew, but that wasn't unique, that was actually
But that might be why he would privilege like
a
a Hebrew
text.
over a Yiddish.
A Hebrew text, yeah.
I'm going to show my ignorance of the New Testament, but the Gospels are different one from the other, and they're written over time, there are gaps. So how did he deal with each one in sequence, each book?
Well, we only know Mark and Matthew because
Okay,
he
well,
doesn't,
that's enough.
right, because he doesn't
That's
have.
enough of a
because-
contrast.
Right. No, so look, Mark and Matthew, as he knew, and he talks about this, all that, 80% of what's in Matthew is in Mark. I mean, he knew, he doesn't really talk about which one was written first, although that at that time there was already a disagreement in terms of which one was written first. But I don't think it mattered to them, to him. I think, again, just coming from Lithuania and the yeshiva world, it was just like a Talmudic text. It was just there on the page. The thing was there, and he was going to comment on it. Very often he'll say, in his Mark commentary, well, this verse in Matthew says this, and go look at my comment over there, or, he's not interested in source criticism, right? That's not his project. His project is that he's taking the two texts as they are, but he certainly acknowledges the repetition, and he doesn't really talk about the historicity that much, which was first and which was second. Yes, Beth?
Yeah, in his sort of harmonization project, or does he engage at all with the Talmudic Jesus, the Ben Patera, the Ben Stada, Toldot Yeshu, anything like that?
Yeah, all the time, yeah. He has all of those things, and all those things you can find in Peter Schaeffer's Jesus in the Talmud, that goes through all, he's playing with all of them. And he uses them when it serves him, right? I mean, he's a commentator that has a very specific agenda, as most commentators do. And he will use all of those Talmudic passages when it serves him. He doesn't, interestingly you bring that up, he doesn't use Toldot Yeshu as far as I know.
No, but he says they're all not about this Jesus,
Yeah.
right? All the negative things. And all,
Separate Jesus.
now they're about a Jesus who lived around 180 BCE, and then another one who lived at the time of our Covenant.
Right.
Because of Yoshua ben Prachia, he's dating him earlier, and thus he's
Yeah, his chronologies, because I think you go through the chronology
Yeah.
or something, and show it's a little off. You've got a couple notes there that kind of,
Right.
the chronology's off, but this at least makes it a different Jesus. The only Talmudic reference to Jesus that he says is about Jesus of Nazareth is the one that speaks of him approvingly.
Right.
Do you have access to the censored stuff?
Probably not. Probably not. I mean, that stuff comes out later. I mean, the manuscript stuff. No, I think he had probably the Vilna Daf, and that was it. Right? I mean, the Toldot Yeshu, which is the stuff that, not the Talmudic stuff, but the Toldot Yeshu, which is the really, really negative stuff, he certainly knew about, because Jews in Eastern Europe at that time all knew Talmudation, right? But he never talks about it.
No, just those Talmudic passages.
Yes, please.
It was interesting to me to hear you just mention very quickly at the beginning that he would not have been aware particularly of Reform at all. And I wonder whether Reform as it was emerging became aware of him. Some of the ways that maybe Isaac Mayer Wise or other people are starting to think about universalizing some elements of Judaism to think about their alignment with Christianity, in part for the polemic of making Jews aligned with Christians.
Right.
I wonder whether any of those people are making use of him since he's in English and he's in German.
Right.
Do we know whether any of those people read
So
him?
the one person that it would, the one person for whom that would matter would be Kaufman Kohler, who wrote the most about Christianity of any of those Reform rabbis. And Kohler, in the Church and the Synagogue, and in all of his essays on Christianity in the Jewish Encyclopedia, because he wrote all of the essays, never mentions it. However, interestingly, when I had this conversation at the beginning of working on this project with Susanna Heschel, who wrote the book about Geiger and Jesus, she was the only one I came across that heard of him. She said she had just come across a reference to him. Nothing specific, but she was the only person that I ever mentioned his name that actually said, oh yeah, he wrote this commentary to the New Testament. But Kohler would be that person who if Elijah Soloveitchik's work was available in the late 19th, early 20th century among the Reform movement, more than Isaac Mayer Wise, it would be Kohler who would have known him, and I don't think that he would have.
Yeah, it's not everybody's favorite gospel, but why haven't we heard anything about John?
Right, so obviously, John would have been where the rubber hits the road.
That's the
right?
heavy-
And we'll get him Romans.
And he doesn't write about John. We don't know why he doesn't write about John, whether he just didn't get to it, or whether he, had some aversion to it, or, he doesn't write about Paul either, although he does mention Paul in his commentary. He does use Pauline text in the commentary to make a point about a verse in Mark or Matthew. So right, that would be, in a certain sense.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether he sort of considers only those three gospels as somehow giving the sort of unadulterated Jewish Jesus, and that everything takes a left turn after that. And,
Right.
John and Christianity, when it starts to make divinity claims. Because he does talk a few times that Jesus keeps warning that people will come in my name and will mislead you. And he says what that means is they will mislead you by saying that I was divine. And,
Right.
so.
He has one reference in a footnote in the 1850 commentary to Maimonides' 13 Principles. He has one reference to the Trinity, and it's interesting. It's a long footnote, but he calls it a great mystery.
Wow.
Yeah, he doesn't refute it. Yeah, he just says it's a great mystery.
Well, actually, probably everybody could agree on that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Although the political project is very different, as you're describing the kind of flattening of sources and using sources from hundreds of years later, it sounds, in a way, quite similar to what Hebrew Maskilim would have been doing in the 19th century. So do you really only see him as some sort of yeshiva bacher, or is he also in the Maskilic tradition?
From my reading of him, and you could read the commentary and decide for yourself, it doesn't seem to me that he had a lot of interest in the kinds of questions that some of those Maskilim were interested in, like Isaac Ber Levinson, or people like that were working with this material. It doesn't seem though. So in the introduction, I do engage in Eli Stern's essay "Catholic Israel," who talks about some of these Maskilic figures in the 19th century who were dealing with similar questions about the Talmud and Christianity. But it doesn't, just to set a context, but it doesn't seem like Elijah Zvi really seemed to really care that much about that. I mean, he really did seem to, the commentary had a very Beit Midrashic feel about it.
Well, some of those guys also.
Also, yeah, but they were already influenced by other kinds of, they were already influenced by the Tübingen school, and they already were, their lens was much wider, I think, than his.
If you didn't know it was the New Testament that he was commenting on, it would just look almost as if he's commenting on some rabbinic stories or legends.
Right.
That's really what it feels like.
Yeah, and based, actually, that comment suggests what I'm about to ask, and that is based on your presentation about Soloveitchik's focus on Mark and Matthew, who are contemporaries of Jesus. Correct?
Well, not really, no.
Not Mark?
It's hard to say. He certainly thought so.
All right, but my question is, based on what you shared with us about Soloveitchik's understanding the two books of the gospel, what would you think about maybe one of his objectives was to treat these books as if they were an extension of the Apocrypha?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think, well, depends
Jewish
on,
but not canonical.
Right. Yes. Kind of non-canonical Jewish texts. I think basically, there's a line that I wanted to read, which is one of the two lines, which is the kind of the epigraphs of the book. One is by Stanislav Hoga, who was his, and one was by Delitzsch. So Delitzsch says the emergence of Christianity belongs to the history of Judaism. This is Delitzsch, a Christian, saying this. And Hoga says it is vain to think of the conversion of the Jews to Christianity before Christians themselves are converted to Judaism.
Wow.
Now this is a person who converted to Christianity. Right? In a certain sense, I felt like these two kind of little, epigraphs kind of capture, in a certain sense, the spirit of, neither one said by Soloveitchik, but capture kind of the spirit of the book in a certain way. He certainly considered themselves Jewish. He certainly considered them Jewish books. Yeah.
But they're Torsion.
Yeah, I was just wondering, right around this time, in a very different cultural context, we have someone like Elijah ben Amozeg, who is talking about the 7 laws of Noah,
Right.
that non-Jews should be Christians. He doesn't want his followers to convert to Judaism, that Christianity is a misunderstanding of Kabbalah. And I'm just wondering where, and then obviously he's in Italy, so it's a whole different cultural background. I was wondering how you see them comparing against one
Right.
another.
That's a fascinating question, because Ben Amozeg, who dies in 1900, so he's a little bit younger, who's writing in Italy, but also writing in French, writing in Italian and in French, and also in Hebrew. He would be an interesting person to compare to Soloveitchik. I think one major difference is what you mentioned, that there is not one reference in the entire commentary of Soloveitchik to anything Kabbalistic. Not one reference to the Zohar.
The Yesod V'Dover, you said, great mystery in the
Well, the great mystery, but it's not Kabbalistic. There are mysteries that are not Kabbalistic. Right. Whereas Ben Amozeg is in a certain sense basing his humanism or universalism, or his attempt to universalize Judaism through the kind of through the lens of Kabbalah. I don't think that I've read a bunch of Amozeg stuff, and I read a really great dissertation on Ben Amozeg, and there was no reference to Elijah Zvi Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik would have probably not known. They probably would not have known each other, even if they were, they could have. But again, I think it would be an interesting thing to take somebody like Ben Amozeg's writings on Christianity and to compare them to and contrast them. Right.
Can I ask one more question? Listening to all the comments, did he treat the gospel as oral Torah, or did it have a certain sacredness, gospelness? What is the sense you got from his reading?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, using those categories, written Torah, oral Torah. I mean, I don't know.
Sounds like more so Talmudic text.
It's more right. The Gospels for him were closer to a Talmudic text than they were to Scripture, for sure.
Yeah, and a few times too, he has no problem saying, "Oh, there's a scribal error here," or the copy, this was copied wrong, or so he recognizes it's subject to trade issues that might be relevant. I have one other poignant element in all of this for me as I read through the commentary. In Matthew and Mark, there's a whole lot of healing going on. I don't think I had quite realized that, because sitting down and reading them really
Right.
straight through. There's a lot of healing going on, a lot of the blind who can see, and a lot of the sick who are healed. And each one of those, he glosses with references to the righteous man will live by his faith and righteousness. The tzaddik, it's precisely this that gives you the power, even the power over nature. At one point he says, and the ability to heal. And then you reminded me again with your introduction that he was a very ill man.
Right.
And there's a certain irony to the fact that he ended his life blind. And here he was writing about Jesus, and there's a real, in those passages, you know, the number of times he asserts that faith will be the thing that will heal you and help the blind see.
Yeah.
And so he ends up being a more tragic figure to me because of that element of his personal biography. And he traveled so much seeking cures.
Cures all over
and,
Europe, yeah.
And is he drawn in some ways to Jesus as a healing figure through faith, partly because of his own biography and illness.
Yes, yeah, and it's, I mean, I didn't actually talk about that in the comparison with Rufusson, because Rufusson also has a whole story about why Christianity answered his trauma of the experience of the Holocaust.
Interesting.
Right, and Rufusson talks about it explicitly. The other thing I would mention, which is just a bit of irony, is that this Soloveitchik spent so much of his life trying to show the theological symmetry between Judaism and Christianity, and then the latest Soloveitchik, the Rav Soloveitchik, wrote an article confrontation basically arguing that there are no theological similarities between Judaism. So I don't think that the late Soloveitchik knew the early Soloveitchik, but it's a kind of an interesting bookend to the Soloveitchik.
But they both use Maimonides and make their argument.
But they both use
everyone else.
That's good.
If there are no more questions, I think we can call this evening to a close. And thank you all very much.
Thank you so much to Chris and to Shaul for sharing all of your teaching with us tonight. We're so appreciative of it. Thank you to all of you for joining us for tonight, for joining us throughout the year. We have had a monthly series of these Shalom talks, and it has been wonderful to get to know some of you over the course of the last 9 to 10 months. So thank you for coming and for learning with us. We're taking a break for the summer, but we'll be kicking off again in hopefully August or September. So keep your eyes open for email coming over the summer with information about events to come. And if you would just indulge me for one moment, I have to say thank you to my colleague Hannah Kober. Hannah has been working at the Hartman Institute for 2 years. She's leaving us to go to graduate school. This was her last program that she was staffing. Congratulations. Thank you, Hannah, for all of your hard work helping us do this and do all of the things that you've done over the last year. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. Have a lovely evening and an excellent summer, and we'll see you in the fall.
If anybody wants to see the 1870 Paris printing, I have a copy of it here.
Mayor.
He doesn't.